Okay, good morning or good afternoon as it is here in Israel. Um, I'm pleased that you joined us for this talk, which I presumptuously have called, or pretentiously have called God's Home and Journey Through the Generations. It occurred to me that given the fact that the synagogues are not open and that we're sort of miss them very much, it might be an opportunity from a distance to take a look at what exactly is supposed to go on in the synagogue. Not in terms of so much in terms of practice, but in terms of perception. And I'd like to explore with you a dimension of the synagogue, which the Beit Knesset, the shul, which a lot of people are not aware, and that is, we just start. So first of all, um, the two institutions for worship of God, which are usually counterpoise to each other, as there are the Beit Mikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, which existed in the first temple existed from the 10th century BCE until 586 BCE, and the second temple, which was consecrated in 516 BCE and was destroyed in 70 CE. Um, and the third one we hope will arrive either by human or by divine agent. Point of contention between Jewish authorities and Beit Knesset, the synagogue. And it's the relationship between these two that I'd like to examine with you today. It comes to Beit Mikdash, there's all kinds of pictures to see what it looked like, all kinds of reconstructions that are based on literary remains and other things, inscriptions and so on. In fact, I really highly recommend if you come when flights are back in and when things excuse me, when things get back to normal, that when any of you are in Jerusalem, that you visit the in Nachlat Shiva in Jerusalem, and also at the Kotel is a 3D. It's not 3D. What's it called? Virtual reality thing, which you go through and you can actually look as if you're walking in it. It's an amazing thing. Anyways, that's the Beit HaMikdash. But there are other kinds of Beit Knesset. Knesset is that's the Old Neuschel in Prague, the oldest still functioning synagogue in the world. It was built in the 13th century. It's still functioning. And then there's of course the major shul in Jerba, which was written on time. Different styles, different things. So the question is, what could unite these three, and how can we talk about temple and synagogue in the same way? And why is it that some synagogues, non-Orthodox synagogues, call themselves temple? We're going to have to really look at that and see what it's all about. So we have to start, as always, with a verse from the Bible. In this case, it's a verse from the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel was born in Jerusalem and was exiled with one of the earlier exiles from Jerusalem by the Babylonians, and was already in Babylonia when he heard that the first temple, had been destroyed in 586. He took this very personally, not just as a Jew, but he was also a Kohen. He was also a priest. So his relative, I don't think he himself actually ever served in the temple, but certainly all of his relatives did. And the question of being this feeling of this fear of being abandoned by God, as evidenced by the destruction of the temple, was something which was very much on his mind. And therefore, already in the 11th chapter of his prophetic book, he writes as follows: Say then, thus says the Lord God, I have indeed removed them far among the nations. In other words, I've taken the Jews from the northern kingdom and scattered them around, and I've taken the Jews from the southern kingdom, from Judah, and scattered them around, and scattered them among the countries. And then then the prophet, then Ezekiel, speaking in the name of God, says, and I have become to them a diminished sanctity, but that's in the countries where they have gone. Lemikdash me'at. That's the Hebrew. Now the English here, diminished sanctity, means it's sort of like the Jews have felt abandoned. That's not the proper translation. I brought the English just to show you that, in fact, sometimes the translations, there's an expression in Latin, tradicere, traducere, that when you translate, you also betray. So similarly over here, the point of the verse is not reflected in this translation. What does it mean? I will be for them a mikdash me'at, a lesser sanctuary in the lands in which they are coming. From the very beginning, this verse was understood to mean that The Jews should not feel that they were exiled and therefore abandoned by God. God's presence will go into exile with the Jews, and He Himself, capital H, will actually be there and encompass them and hover over them and make His providence manifest. The Jews are in exile. That's the straightforward meaning of the verse. However, the rabbis already said that they understood the verse to mean it's a mikdash ma'at, that I will provide for them. I will provide for them a lesser sanctuary. In other words, they can't have a temple right now because you're in exile. The temple is destroyed. This is before the second temple is built. But I can arrange for you to have something else, something take its place temporarily. And that's the synagogue, and that's how the earliest translations and the early into Aramaic and all of the interpretations, Jewish classic Jewish statements are that I will be for them, or I will provide for them, lesser sanctuaries, which are simple, but they're good enough in the meantime. Which raises the question: okay, what does good enough mean? What does exactly mean that a synagogue is a mikdash me'at? And the synagogue as an institution, in fact, was started, historically during the Second Temple. So what does it mean? Is it, you can be a little less than temple, you can be like this much, a little less than temple, this much less than temple. So what do we have in mind? So generally speaking, let's move to the next thing. Generally speaking, the idea of the most people, when they hear this idea that the synagogue is a second temple or less than the or a little less than the temple or lesser sanctuary, means that, I don't call it sloppy seconds, God forbid, but it can't measure up to the temple. It's something which is there, and it's there that the most important thing was the Beit HaMikdash, was the temple, and the synagogue is there to fill some important functions. It's what we have because there's no synagogue, there's no Beit HaMikdash, there's no temple, but it's really it's reflective glory. It's sort of like a stopgap for the meantime. But really, what we really want. What we really aim for is it's a sort of a holding pattern until we get the temple back. That seems to be the way that a lot of people interpret this based on the passage over here. So you have a picture of the March of Titus when the Romans took away the spoils of the temple. Mishnah says in Rosh Hashanah, I'm sorry, there's a mistake here. It should be not Mishnah, it's Mishnah. If Yom Tov or Rosh Hashanah fell on Shabbat, they would blow the temple shofar in the temple, but not in the country, not outside the temple. In other words, there is a mitzvah to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Everybody knows that's the one they come for. They want to hear the ram's horn blown. We don't blow, if Rosh Hashanah falls, it can only be the first day of Rosh Hashanah. If the first day of Rosh Hashanah falls in Shabbat, we don't blow the shofar. Why? We don't blow the shofar because, according to the standard explanation, it's because you're afraid that a person might carry it outside on Shabbat and violate Shabbat because they're so excited about blowing shofar. The guy who blew shofar, if the guy got all excited about Yontif and he forgot the shofar at home, and there's no eruv and you can't carry, and what are you going to do? And you'll get all bent out of shape. And lest that happen, the rabbis basically banned blowing the shofar on Shabbat, even though you could plan ahead and bring it, but that was the ruling. After the destruction of the temple, says the Mishnah. After the destruction of the temple, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai decreed that it should be blown on Shabbat in every place where there is a court. Whenever there's a place which has a major court, you can blow the shofar. Okay. Other Mishnayot. So in other words, there is this effort on the part of the rabbis who lived after the destruction to perpetuate and to continue doing things in the synagogue, or in where the courts met in the synagogues that went on in the temple. Similarly, this is a mission I forgot to put on here. I apologize. The rule from the Torah is that on the first day of Sukkot, everywhere Jews live, they take four types of growing things. We call it a lulav etrog. It's really made out of four different types of plants. There's a palm branch, there's a citron, which is yellow, there's a willow, and there are myrtle branches. You carry them together, and all Jews, all observant Jews, take this thing everywhere. It doesn't matter what. That's what the Torah had in mind. The Torah did not have in mind that we do it more than one day. In the temple, in the time of the temple, there was a procession with the four species, these lulav and esrog, every single day, but only in the temple. When the temple was destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was the person who really led the Jewish people in the wake of the destruction and helped to reconstitute Judaism and get over the shock of the temple's destruction by the Romans, said, no, you know what? We are now, in memory of the temple, we are going to do in the temple, in the synagogue, what we did in the temple. In other words, instead of just having taking the lulav and etrog one day, we're going to do it 7 days. And there's a whole slew of things along those lines that, the temple is what's important, and the synagogue is going to be a place we're going to have a holding pattern until we get the temple back. And when this thing was going on, there was expectation that maybe we could bribe the Romans or convince the Romans to let us build the temple again. Okay, so that's what it means, MIQDASH Ma'at. The most important thing is the MIQDASH, is the temple, but the synagogue is something there if we don't have a temple. But in the absence of a temple, we have a synagogue. Recent research, some of it mine, has come to the conclusion that like as Sport and Life says in Porgy and Bess, it ain't necessarily so. The concept of MIQDASH Me'at, at least the way it was understood, seems to point in a different direction and affects the way we deal with the synagogue in general. One of the earliest expressions of this shift, and I haven't described it yet, is found in the pictures before you. North of Tveria is the town of, or was a city once, of Migdal. Migdal is better known to Christians as Magdala, because Mary Magdalene, who was something, Jesus' his wife or something, came from there. But Migdal was a serious Jewish town. It was evidently populated by a lot of priests, by a lot of Kohanim, because there were a lot of houses that they found near the synagogue, which have mikvaot in them. And the only people at the time who really needed a mikveh in the house was the Kohen, because they would get all kinds of special gifts from the people, which required, if they're going to eat them, food gifts, they would have to immerse in a mikveh. So if you find a mikveh in a house in Second Temple era Israel, odds are that a priest lived there. In any event, we know that Migdal was destroyed in the revolt against Rome before the destruction of the temple, 68, 69, whatever it is. And yet, when recently they excavated, they didn't know where Migdal was, but they found it by accident. The truth is, the story is that the Catholic Church wanted to build some kind of like a hostel for pilgrims, because in the Galil are all these holy places for Christians, and they bought a piece of land. They started digging, and they came up with this whole archaeological find. So they moved their guest house further north, and together with the Israel Antiquities Authority, they started digging, and they discovered Migdal. And in Migdal, they discovered a synagogue from before the destruction of the temple. If you look at the picture on the left, you can see it's quite an impressive picture, impressive building. You can see in the middle, sort of like a T shape, or actually a U shape, form. That's where the people would sit. The doors of the synagogue face southeast, I should say, because faces Jerusalem. This is in the north. They're beautiful. You can see on the right-hand side, they have beautiful pillars. It was apparently a very, very elaborate synagogue, which cost a lot of money to build. And it was really kind of sad because it wasn't up very long, because it was destroyed by the Romans not long after it was built or finished built. So it's a synagogue. So very nice. So the synagogue, we know there was synagogues from the time of the first temple, so of the first exile. So what's the big deal? The big deal is, if you look in the picture on the right-hand side, in the middle is a stone, found right in the middle of the sitting area, facing the area where they would have the table upon which they would read the Torah, is this stone. What's the stone? The way it's made cannot have been used for reading. And many historians didn't know what it was for. Let's take a closer look, actually. Here's the stone of Migdal. If you take a look at the sides, especially the picture on the left, you'll see that the that the in the middle is the menorah, which may very well have been described by a person who saw the menorah, because the temple's still standing. Don't forget, a menorah and two jugs. One is apparently of oil, and the other one it's not 100% clear. On the other sides, I don't have. You can see on the right hand side, on the left, you can see you can see sheaves of grain, but to the left, you can actually see also you can also see I think it's a shofar. The point, the important part here is the menorah. Why is there a picture of the menorah? Why is there a bas relief, what's called, in other words, a cutout of the menorah in this rock, and why is that rock in the middle of the synagogue? There was only one menorah, and that menorah is in the temple. So why would you do that? So why would you inscribe a stone that you put in the middle of your synagogue for reasons we don't know why it's there in with the menorah? So here we come to a theory which is called miniaturization. What's miniaturization? There was a practice in ancient times to connect places by invoking in place B something in place A, which was more important. In our case, you would say as a result that in fact the reason why there's a picture of the menorah and other things which might be reminiscent of the temple was to make the point that yes, you're in Migdal, north of Tveria, in the Galilee, on the shores of Lake Kinneret, but the synagogue derives its sanctity and derives its reality from the Beit HaMikdash. If you want to use internet language, you could say the synagogue is a mikdash me'at. It's a lesser sanctuary, not because it on its own has lesser status, but because it is a portal to the Beit HaMikdash. You walk into the synagogue, you are effectively in the Beit HaMikdash. The reality of the synagogue is a result of Beit HaMikdash. Now that seems like a lot to hang on this stone, but let's see. There are other indications that that's exactly what's going on. For example, the Midrash tells us, and this has been confirmed by archaeology, that the front part of the temple complex, those of you who've been to Jerusalem know that there's this huge thing called Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount. It's really not all Har HaBayit. It's not all of it is does not have sanctity. What happened was the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, was built by Solomon, and then later by the people who came back from Babylonia. It was built on a mountain, and then that mountain was expanded by a platform, huge platform, which made the area like 3 times. Hera did the biggest expansion. In any event, so that's a Temple Mount. That is of lesser sanctity if it has is like, but in the middle where the gold dome of the rock is, where the golden dome is, that's probably where the Beit HaMikdash was. And if you look at the pictures of what the Beit HaMikdash looked like, the front of it, which faced east, had 3 gates. And we're going to talk about those gates in a minute. Those 3 gates, according to the Midrash, there was the main gate in the middle, and on the left-hand side was a gate for mourners who would come into the Beit HaMikdash, and if they saw you walking in through that gate, it was smaller, the people would know to comfort you. They'd say, where he was causes his presence to indwell in this house should comfort you. And on the right hand side was for chatanim, for bridegrooms, where people say mazel tov. Okay. Every synagogue overwhelmingly, synagogues that were built in Eretz Yisrael after the temple was destroyed have 3 gates. To make the point that this is, in some real sense, not a sloppy seconds, but some sense this is Beit HaMikdash, but it's because you are basically invoking Beit HaMikdash. Here on the left-hand side is the famous Biram synagogue in the Upper Galilee of the Middle Lebanese border. On the right-hand side is a synagogue in Meron. Now, we celebrated Lag BaOmer this week, and everybody went. No, nobody couldn't go to Meron, but people like to go to Meron. That's the grave of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. That's where his and Lag BaOmer traditionally is his yard site. So people actually spend most of their time looking at the gravesite there's a huge there's a whole building, and it's very nice and so on and so forth. But they don't turn around. They turn around, they would see actually a synagogue built on a site built on the site of ancient Meron, which looks just like the Beit HaMikdash. The idea is when you go into a shul, it invokes the Beit HaMikdash. Are you really in the Beit HaMikdash? Is it a portal? Okay, so based on the doors, you could argue no, it's supposed to be just like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said. You should use a little bit extra 7 days in memory. So we're memorializing. It's not really the same thing. Well, maybe yeah, maybe no, because there is more evidence. Here we have a wall painting, some wall paintings from a synagogue from the synagogue in DURA, EUROPOS, in central eastern Syria near the Iraqi border. Now, this synagogue was built in the early 3rd century, around the same time of the Rabbi Yehuda Nasi finished the Mishnah, and it was in Syria, but it was under Roman rule, which meant that as far as teachings are concerned, as far as the form of Judaism is concerned, they were students not of Babylonia, even though geographically they were probably closer to Babylonia than to Eretz Yisrael, but they were very much Eretz Yisraeli in terms of who they looked to for guidance at the time. During EUROPOS, when it was excavated in the early part of the 20th century, they came and they found these stunning wall paintings on the walls. It's a unique synagogue for a lot of other reasons. You see on the left-hand side, it has a niche. It's one of the earliest synagogues that we know of where the Aron, where the Torah is kept, was actually built in. This is not standard practice in ancient synagogues. The Torah is kept in a big box, which is then brought in and brought out. But here already you have a built-in niche. But more importantly, it's more important for our purposes are the wall paintings. Now, the wall painting, Dura EUROPOS was destroyed by ISIS. It was leveled during its occupation of the area. But the panels were photographed and then taken to the art museum in Damascus many, many years ago, so they were safe. It's sort of funny to say that it's safe in Damascus, but I guess everything's relative. In any event, you have all kinds of different pictures of biblical scenes. There are famous pictures of King David being anointed by Samuel. You've got the illuminations of David, Joseph, and his brothers. All kinds of stuff. But what's really stunning is over the ark. Over the ark, all of the pictures on the level on the upper 2 tiers are about the Beit HaMikdash. Take a look on the right-hand side. Again, you have the Beit HaMikdash with the 3 gates. You have Aaron HaKohen on the right-hand side in Greek. You've got the menorah. You've got sacrifices on the left. You've got people coming and bringing all kinds of other sacrifices, and scattered around in other places in the immediate area around the ark are other utensils that they used in the temple. So, why put that specifically in the front, and why put it over the ark? So I actually asked an art historian, a colleague of mine, a religious woman who's the head of Jewish art at Hebrew University. Her name is Professor Sarit Shalev-Ini, and she said the idea is that art. What does art do? Art draws you into itself. When you go to a museum, for example, what do you do? I mean, every art museum has benches, and you sit there and you sort of like merge with the picture. That's what art is supposed to do. It's supposed to draw you in. The point of these pictures was people come into this shul and they take a look, and they're facing, of course, the Aron, which in this case is facing southwest because it's facing Yerushalayim, and you're drawn into the picture. The idea is that you are no longer in Dura EUROPOS. You are no longer in a synagogue. You are, in a very real sense, you are in the Beit HaMikdash, because the reality of the synagogue is the reality of the Beit HaMikdash. So, if you see a pattern here, that you have the stone which says menorah, but the menorah is not the menorah that we're going to put up in this shul. It's the one in Beit HaMikdash to connect the two. three gates because not because I want to remember what was, but what actually is in a theoretical sense. The temple was destroyed, but apparently this idea of Mikdash can still go. And similarly, you have it in the art in terms of DURA EUROPOS. So you know what? So you could argue to me and say, "Nah, that's you're stretching it. This is art. You know, art can be interpreted this way or that way." Well, I can actually prove my point that when you go in the synagogue, you're actually in the Beit HaMikdash and you're standing before God by, at the very least, a series of Ashkenazi practices in the synagogue, which confirm what I'm telling you. Hold on. So, for example, you can see what the people are over there. The priests over here are giving the Birkat Kohanim. They're doing the priestly blessing, which is done in the diaspora, is done among Ashkenazim on holidays and Rosh Hashanah and Kippur. Here in Israel, we do it every day, which is the proper way to do it. But there were restrictions on that. There were restrictions on that blessing. One of the restrictions is found in the Mishnah. I'm going to read it and translate. Kohen sheyesh biyadav mumin, a kohen whose hands are deformed, lo yisa et kapav. He shouldn't bless the people. Mipnei shaha mistaklim bo, because the people look at him. The people stare at him. You'll object perhaps, and if you look from this picture, that should be the first objection. That we know that the priests cover their heads with talitot. So what are we talking about? The answer is that that's a relatively late custom. Originally, when the priests would offer the blessing, and for many generations afterwards, the Kohanim would just put their hands up, and that was it. There was no talesim. Once they started covering their hands with talitot, this Mishnah no longer was relevant because the problem was was solved. But look what Rashi says. Why? So why can't you look at them? What's the problem? Why should we discriminate against the Kohen whose hands are deformed, or for example, or if one of the other things in the Mishnah, which I didn't cite here, is say this Kohen likes to paint his house, and because he liked to paint his house, so his hands became discolored. Why should that be an issue? So Rashi says, Lefisha mistaklimbo, the people look at it. Vamrinan b'masechet chagiga, and the Torah Talmud says in Tractate Chagiga, hamistakel b'kohanim b'shah shenosim et kapehem einav kehot, lefisha SHEKHINAH sharal yedehen. That when you look at the Kohanim, when they are blessing the people, you'll go blind. Why? Because God's presence, veritable presence, hovers over their hands. Why? Because the Torah says that v'samuot shemi al bnei Yisrael bani avarchem, that the priest should bless the people, but really it's God's presence that gives blessing. All right, there's a discussion about that. It's not really relevant right now. In other words, when the priests bless in the temple, God's presence comes in its full plenitude, hovers over their hands. Okay. But Tosfos says, what are you talking? But the Tosfos say, what are you talking about? Why should you explain the Mishnah this way? We're talking here about the time after the destruction of the temple. What is one thing got to do with the other? We're talking about synagogues, and you're talking about the Beit HaMikdash. So Tosafot says that's ridiculous. That's not right. The reason why you're not supposed to look at the person with the four hands, because you'll take your mind off the blessing, and you won't pay attention. Okay. But Rashi sticks with his own. If you take Rashi at his face value, which is no reason why not, Rashi thinks that when the Kohanim bless the people, God's presence is there as if it were the Beit HaMikdash. Am I stretching things? I don't think so. Because I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Because there are other indications that plenty of very fine rabbis thought that God's presence was actually 150% in the temple, in the synagogue. So here on the left-hand side, you have a picture of the Altnoishel, as I said, which is the oldest still functioning synagogue in the world. This is a passage from a book called the Sefer Rokeach. It's a book of halacha that was written by a man named Rabbi Elazar Rokeach, Rabbi Elazar of Worms, at the end of the 12th century, late 13th century. And he quotes somebody even earlier, somebody a little bit younger than Rashi, who makes an interesting comment. Rabbeinu Chizkiah mefaresh. Rabbi Chizkiah, who was himself a scholar of some note, shelefichach omer, that the reason why you say a verse kishemachzirim sefer Torah li'itudim koma, why is it that we say a certain verse when we return the Torah to the ark? And what's the verse? Ramamu Hashem Elokeinu v'yishtachavu. Make great or praise God and bow down. V'gam b'birkat Torah, v'gam b'birkat Torah, mishtachavim lechavod Torah. You bow. They're telling us on the way that as part of the choreography of the synagogue, you bow. We don't bow. We bow down twice a year, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. That's it. But apparently, they bowed. And why did they bow? They bowed because the protocol of the temple required bowing. They would also bow. I didn't bring it. I didn't decide it here. Jews would also bow when they were coming in, and when they were going out, and that that is based on explicit statement in the Midrash, which is called Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, that people Laharabayit, they would bow on the way in and bow on the way out, meaning that I am taking. It's not just a matter I'm doing a ritual that was in the temple. I'm actually acting as if I'm in the temple. Follow the difference? And then he goes on and he says, apropos of the point we're making now, Kishemachzirim ota, when you return the Torah to the ark, Omer Yehalalu, Yehalalu Hashem Hashem Kinis Gav, praise God, Lahodiacha, to tell you, Shalo Bishvil Elokut Shebatorah Mishtachaveh, that when again you're bowing down all the way down to your face, at the end, when on the way into giving the Torah back, which is what they did at the time, Ella Lekadosh Baruch Hu Mishtachaveh. You have to remember, you bow down to God, not to the Torah. And why do you bow down? Sheshchinato Shora Alav. Because God's presence in its full plenitude is in the synagogue. Now you can say this is memorial from today to tomorrow, but to say that God's presence is in the synagogue in the same way as in the Beit HaMikdash, clinches the identification of the two. So apparently, the Mishnah Mikdash Ma'at is not just a makeshift substitute, but it really becomes an extension of the Beit HaMikdash, even when the Beit HaMikdash is non-existent. Similarly, that's the reason why. Ironically, that's the reason why the Ashkenazim have this funny practice, this funny unusual custom, of only offering the blessing on Yom Tov. Truth of the matter is, if you look in the Talmud, the priest is supposed to bless the people every day, and it doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter if you're in Far Rockaway, or if you're in Los Angeles, or if you're in South Africa, or in Israel. It's a mitzvah which is not geographically determined, and which is supposed to happen every single day. In fact, Persian Jews still do it. That's the original custom. So what happened that all of a sudden Ashkenazim don't do it? They only do it on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. This is a statement now. So here what you have is the inside of the old synagogue in Regensburg. And if you take a look, this is a passage from Sefer Hasidim, which is a text that was written in the also in the late 12th, early 13th century. And the passage apparently makes no sense, because it says, "Hinhigu hakohanim biyamim tovim la'alot laduchan," that they decided that we should at least let people go and get the priest bless the people on Yom Tov, on Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, whatever. Why? Why should we allow that? Lefi shechayav adam letaher beregel, because a person has to go to mikveh before Yom Tov. V'hayu hakohanim mitarim et atzmam umevarchim betaratam, and the kohanim would, like everybody else, would go to mikveh. What are we talking about? Nowhere does it say in the Talmud or in the codes, that a Kohen has to go to mikveh before he blesses the people. On the contrary, were the priestly blessing a part of the temple ritual, then that would make sense. They would have to go to mikveh because everything you do in regard to the temple has to be done for purity. But it's not. It's just a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah like a mitzvah. So that's A. B. Why did everybody in Ashkenaz, at least, in France and Germany in the Middle Ages and later, why did they go to mikveh of Yontif? The statement that a person has to go to mikveh, a person has to purify themselves before Yontif, is a statement, as Maimonides says, it's a statement that a person who's going to go to the Beit HaMikdash has to go, wants to participate in the services, and he wants to go on pilgrimage, and he wants to bring sacrifices. He's got to purify himself. But if there's no Beit HaMikdash, there's no reason to purify yourself. Here, they're in Mainz and they're in Worms and Paris and all kinds of things, and they're assuming that that's what you can do, that's what you have to do. So there are two assumptions. Number one, that you have that Kohanim have to can only offer the blessing if they're pure, and then everybody before Yom Tov has to go to mikveh because otherwise you can't go into shul. Now, halachically, this is not required either of them. However, what comes out of it is very clear, and that is that as far as the Jews were concerned, the Beit HaKnesset, the synagogue, is the temple. Not that they didn't pray for the temple; they wanted it. But this is a case of miniaturization. The building I am in right now is an extension of the building that I want to be in. Or when I go in, I actually am in Jerusalem, like a virtual reality thing. Therefore, if you want to go when Pesach or Shavuot or Sukkot happen, you go to mikveh because you're actually, in a certain profound sense, fulfilling the mitzvah of Aliyah L'Regel, of pilgrimage to the temple. And similarly, they viewed what the Kohanim were doing as as not as a mitzvah, but as an avoda, as something in the as something which is performed only in the temple. There's even an interesting proof of that. Another interesting proof. The last three blessings of the Shemona Esrei that you say 3 times a day are always the same. One is called Ritzei, it's Birkat Avodah. It asks God to please bring back the temple and to bring back the service in the temple. Then there's Modim, which is a blessing of thanks. And then Sim Shalom, that God should prayer for peace. The priestly blessing is pegged to the last one because the last word in the blessing is Yiseinu L'cha Shalom, may God give you peace. Okay. That blessing, the first of those three, the Birkat Avodah, ends Hamachzir Shechinato L'Tzion. Blessed art thou who will ultimately bring back his Shechina, where not to the synagogue, but to Zion. The ancient Ashkenazic practice, which is still maintained in many places, is that when the Kohanim, when the priests give the blessing on the Chagim, they don't say Hamachzir Shechinato L'Tzion. They don't give the normal prayer that we hope that someday we'll have service in the temple. They use the formula that was used in the temple when the various services were performed, whether it's sacrifices, whether it was blessings, whatever the case might be, and that is Sha'otcha B'levarcha B'yiran Avod, that we will serve you alone with awe. And the operative word here is na'avod. The word na'avod or avodah means service or worship, but in the context it means the service in the temple. So there could be no greater proof of the fact that they perceive that what they're doing is actually doing temple in the synagogue. Now, doing temple in the synagogue in terms of sacrifices is a major sin. So obviously that's what they're not doing. But this idea that there's this intimate, inseparable connection between the synagogue and the temple, and that the temple was a living, pulsating reality for the spiritual reality for people in the synagogue, and that they saw a direct connection between what they're doing and what's on the Temple Mount. It's obvious that that's the case. Now, The it's interesting to note that as time went on, towards the 14th, 15th century, we were talking about the 12th, when most of Ashkenazi customs were set, there were indications that this sort of feeling of the intensity, some have argued that this sort of sense of intensity of the identification between the Beit HaKnesset and the Beit HaMikdash weakened. How do I know? There's one story there in 1340. Coming back to, we were talking about COVID-19. In 1348, 1349, the Black Death came to Europe, and the Jews were blamed for poisoning the wells, corrupting the water, corrupting the air, and hundreds and hundreds of Jewish communities, especially in Germany, were destroyed. It was. I hesitate to use the word, but it was in terms of what they knew. It certainly was nothing less than a Holocaust. After the plague began to subside, it never really went away. It didn't go away until the 17th century. But this began to subside, and Jews tried to reconstruct their lives after all this destruction and expulsion. The rabbis basically spend most of their time, the major rabbis spend their time collecting music and customs and so on, so that the fabric of daily life should be able to be restored. One of the people who was most active in this and trying to record and preserve that which went before the dislocations of 1348, 1349 was a man named Rabbi Yaakov Halevi, otherwise known as Maharil. In his book, which is a collection of minhagim, which is actually he didn't write. It was actually his. He had a Boswell, somebody who wrote down things for him, and the guy's name was Rabbi Zalman of Sangwar was his name. In any case, he describes the following story: that one time that there was a custom that this is before there was such a thing as Kabbalat Shabbat. You know, the pre-service on Friday afternoon is called Kabbalat Shabbat, receiving Shabbat. It ends with Lecha Dodi, and then you go into the usual prayer for Arvit. That did not exist in the 14th century. It was invented in the 16th century in Tzfat by the Mekubalim. Present practice is, or what am I telling you this for? Because those of you who might be familiar that if a person, God forbid, is sitting Shiva, he lost somebody sitting Shiva. In the middle of the week, he doesn't go out of the house the entire week, but for Shabbat, he goes out of the house and he comes to Shul. The practice is that he stays outside the synagogue until after Lecha Dodi, and when it comes time for Arvit, then everybody stands up and they say, "Hamakom yenachem etcha etchem b'toch sha'ara ve'lei Tzion v'Yerushalayim." May God comfort you in the midst of the other mourners of Zion in Jerusalem, and they participate in Amayrav. In 14th century Germany, the practice was a little different. That if the person was sitting Shiva, that after the services were over, the mourner would sit in the courtyard of the synagogue. Of course, all synagogues had courtyards, and people would walk by and they would say some kind of formula of consolation, and so on. Reports Maharil that his teacher, Rabbi Shalom of Neustadt, who lived and basically most of his career was spent before the Black Death, would traditionally say to the mourner under those circumstances, Misha shikein shemo babayet hazeh hu yinachemcha, which I mentioned before, right? May he who causes his presence to indwell in this house, may he comfort you. Now, as I mentioned before, that was what they said in the Beit HaMikdash when the mourners went into one of the little doors on the side, and people knew that if you went in that door, you must be a mourner. So they would comfort you with that statement. So that's what he said. And Maharil was there, with Rabbi Shalom of Neustadt. So what are you talking about? Why are you using the formula from the Beit HaMikdash here? This is a shul. And Rabbi Shalom of Neustadt said, the synagogue is a Mikdash Me'at. The synagogue is miniature temple, a connection to the temple, and so on. Interestingly, Maharil himself, and this is an interesting point, Maharil himself said, I don't like that. And it took a lot of guts to disagree with his teacher. I think it's inappropriate, and there was something else he would say to the mourners under those circumstances. I thought, I have to tell you, that when I saw this, I said, you know what? So this identification of Beit HaMikdash, like 100% or 99% identification of Beit HaMikdash and Beit Knesset, I guess it was weakening. I guess people didn't really feel that way. Boy, was I wrong. because something like 6 months after I published a book which had a whole chunk on this, I came across this manuscript. This is a manuscript of a machzor. A machzor, or a michlol is actually better. It's a huge, very fancy illuminated Hebrew manuscript, which has a machzor and a siddur and all kinds of other books, and it's beautifully illustrated. It's in the National Library in Hamburg. And what struck my eye was this line. This is from the Haggadah. There's a Haggadah in there also. Here is this illustration is where we recite the words of Rabbi Gamliel, that if you haven't said three things, haven't explained three things as part of the Seder, you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah of telling the story of Egypt. One is Pesach, the Paschal offering, matzah, and maror, bitter herbs. In order to illustrate Pesach, the sacrifice, right, which is only done in the temple, we have this picture. Now look what we have here. We have people standing in line, all dressed in their 14th century finery, all of them holding these cute little lambs. And but notice what's going on. The person who's offering the lamb, here's the knife. Okay, you see this? Here's the lamb on the table. Has a menorah. And here's this thing. First of all, this table has a talus on it with fringes. You see the fringes? Okay, that's number one. This thing is definitely a ner tamid. There was no ner tamid in the Beit HaMikdash. There was a fire that went out. It was on the altar all the time. Never went out, but never ner tamid. And the placement of the menorah is odd, because the menorah was inside the temple building proper, near the Holy of Holies, and which is part of the Holy of Holies, the big building, and the Mizbeach is outside. The altar was outside, but here the altar is inside, but it's got talus on it. What are we talking about? If you take away the lambs and you take away all this other stuff, what you end up is a picture of a synagogue. So the illuminator here is saying, what better way of expressing the fact that the temple and the synagogue are two sides of the same coin? You show people offering sacrifices in a building which is absolutely can't be mistaken as a temple, as a synagogue. So why is this significant? Because the guy who commissioned this manuscript was none other than Rabbi Zalman of Senguar, who was the Boswell to Maharil, who said we shouldn't identify the synagogue and the temple ad kidei kach. So obviously I was wrong, because this idea that the synagogue is a way into the temple was still alive and kicking at the same time, except that whereas the Maharil said you can't act as if it's the temple, you certainly can use the experience being in the synagogue as a way of identifying, of experiencing God's presence, of experiencing God's house, and not just God's house here, but God's house with a capital H, the one on Har HaBayit. Now, I'll take it one step further. Ashkenazim, you'll say, but the temple was destroyed. Yes, but there is a fundamental difference of opinion between Sephardim and Ashkenazim about the third temple. Sephardim, following Rambam, say that the temple will be, that basically that, number one, that the only way we're going to know that a person's a Mashiach is that he succeeds. In other words, if somebody tried to be Mashiach, like Bar Kochba, which is the Rambam writes, and he fails and he dies, then he's clearly not Mashiach. But my Bar Kochba was killed. He's clearly not Mashiach, but he is like all of the righteous and pious kings of Israel. Maimonides says. The point here, what's important is that the point here that the Geulah comes through human initiative. Because the only way that you can know is if you try. If you don't try, you will never know. And one of the things that the Mashiach is supposed to do, according to the Rambam, is to build the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, that's not the Ashkenazic position. The Ashkenazic position is, and Rashi says this twice in his commentaries, that the Beit HaMikdash is not going to be built by human agency, but by divine agency. It will come down from heaven. If It'll come down from heaven. It means it always exists. So therefore, it's not really difficult to have this idea that the synagogue is a portal to the Beit HaMikdash, because the Beit HaMikdash really exists, just exists in a different realm, no less real for that. Interestingly, there's and this is a very typical, it's a very representative Ashkenazic position. So Rashi mentions it in a couple of places. And Rashi, in his commentary on the Bible, for example, in the last verse of the Song of the Red Sea, the last verse is Mikdash Hashem konanu yadecha, the sanctity, O Lord, your own hands will create. And Rashi says because the third temple is going to come down from heaven. There was another rabbi, his name was Rabbi Elazar of Metz, who lived again around the same time in late 12th century. He wrote a book called Sefer Yereim. Sefer Yereim is it's an enumeration of all the commandments, and he uses the opportunity of enumerating all the commandments to tell you all the basic laws about the commandments. So it's a book of mitzvot, and it's also a book of halakha. It's a very interesting book. And one of the things that he writes, he cites every single mitzvah in the Torah, including the ones that aren't relevant right now. I mean, we unfortunately can't perform at the moment. So when it comes to the temple, he has everything there. He's got all the sacrifices, and he's got watching the temple and fixing everything under the sun. So one thing he's missing. He does not count the mitzvah of building the temple, which Maimonides does. Maimonides makes it clear there's a mitzvah to build the temple. Who's going to do it? The Mashiach will do it. But it's not the point. It's a mitzvah which we're supposed to do. The Rabbi Elazar Bimetz in a Sefer Yereim does not count it. How come? I wasn't sure. What? This is weird. I mean, what are you doing all this stuff and there's no building? So a friend of mine says, yeah, but that's the Ashkenazim. They don't think that there's a mitzvah to build the temple because God's going to build the temple. Or the temple's going to come down from heaven. So in a real sense, it already exists. It's a very profound idea. So when you go into the synagogue, you're actually in the Beit HaMikdash, or you're in a building which reflects the Beit HaMikdash, which really exists. You just can't see it. What happens? So the fact that the same person or the same school which said don't do things as they did in the Beit HaMikdash, but is also illustrated using illustrations to show that Beit HaMikdash and Beit KNESSET the same thing. What's happening here? What's happening here is very interesting. What happens here is that slowly but surely, again, this is true of Ashkenazi shows, not of Mizrahi shows. Slowly but surely, fewer and fewer things that are related to the Beit HaMikdash are acted upon in Ashkenazi synagogues. They stop bowing and all kinds of other things. However, just at that point starts the famous Jewish, the elegant tradition of painted synagogues and of elaborate woodcut. Not woodcut. I'm thinking the word is carved arcs. And consistently, this is a picture from showing Chernovitz, which was, unfortunately, most of these things, of course, were destroyed by the Nazis. And we have some early photographs of these things that were done before the World War II, but still, the practice began of putting temple scenes on the walls of the synagogue, which already harks us back to what? It brings us back actually to DURA, EUROPOS, and to MIGDAL. That the art would serve to bring the worshiper into the awareness that in fact they're not just in the synagogue, their hearts are in Jerusalem, their hearts are in the Beit HaMikdash, which made, in a very sense, of concretizes for the worshiper the awareness of the fact that I am part of a larger reality, which is the Beit HaMikdash. Some of these are absolutely elegant. I have a book here which I can strongly recommend by a friend of mine. It's called, here it is, I don't get any percentages for this, but it's called The Carved Wooden Torah Arcs of Eastern Europe by Professor Rachi Yaniv. She found a sheaf of photographs that had been taken in synagogues around Eastern Europe before World War II, and of arcs, of Aronot Kodesh. Some of them they came out okay. Some places didn't come out okay. One of the things which unites all of these arcs is the fact that they all overwhelmingly portray things that invoke the Beit HaMikdash, whether it's the pan which they would use to offer incense, whatever the case may be. One of them is actually really stunning. One of them shows a guy with a lamb, going towards the center, and the other side is a lamb walking away. And a lot of art historians initially thought that this was like a mistake. I mean, what do you mean? It's not symmetric. You should have both of the lambs marching towards the middle. And my colleague, who is Yodat, she's a scholar. She's a scholar not just in art, but in Torah as well. And she said, no, no. You know what this is? This is a picture of the two goats that are offered on Yom Kippur. In one case, the one goat is being sacrificed to God, and the other one is sent off into the desert, sent off into the wilderness. The Seir Lazazel, the scapegoat. So you have on the right hand side the goat that's offered on the altar. On the other hand, you've got the scapegoat. So again, even rituals which we can't have anymore are perpetuated and use art to be able to get across this idea that in a real sense, yes, maybe physically we can't do these things, but we, emotionally and spiritually have to experience as if they are happening now on a different plane. So that you consistently through the Jews throughout their wanderings, the awareness of the Beit HaMikdash was mediated through the synagogue, through the way that you enacted in the synagogue, and most important above all is this idea that in fact God's presence is in the synagogue, and just as if we were in the Beit HaMikdash. How do I know that? So really striking. Rashi had said what? Rashi had said that the reason why a priest who has deformed hands or has stained hands can't bless the people is because it's not appropriate for God's presence to hover over their heads. It's interesting because if you look, as you'll stare and then you'll go blind. And all kinds of other commentators say, "What's he talking about? It's nothing to do. It's not true." But in terms of popular perception, certainly true. Every single person who grew up as a little kid in an Orthodox synagogue was told that you're not supposed to look at the hands of the Kohanim, and they don't say because you won't concentrate on the blessing. It's because if you look at them, you'll go blind. In other words, the way that the popular perception of the synagogue, even after certain things were modified or de-emphasized formally, never ever went away. When the Kohanim act, they're in the temple. The Shekhinah is there, God's providence. And as Maimonides says, it might be true that a synagogue is not as important as the temple, and Maimonides was not as elaborate on this regard as Ashkenazi rabbis. Nevertheless, when you pray, you should always assume that you're standing in front of God's presence. So whether you're Ashkenazi or whether you're Sephardi, the synagogue is the place where the indwelling of the synagogue of the temple, of God's presence, of the Shekhinah, and at the same time, you are you may be in Marrakesh, or you may be in New York, but you're really standing in the courtyards of the temple in Jerusalem, and that's how we should treat our synagogues. And when God willing, we're allowed to go back to our synagogues. That's I think the message. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.